Well, thank you very much for the offer to do this presentation, and likewise, I was very much looking forward to being in sunny Nelson and sampling of its produce, but there we go. I'm now giving a talk with my slippers on, so such is life under COVID. I remember Robin Johnson. I remember his ability to challenge, his ability to argue about things and help people think outside the square. So I suppose in a way, I've taken his prompt and decided that that's really where I want to take the next 30 minutes. So I'm really looking forward also to any questions at the end of this time. So the key themes that I wanted to go through, one is that we are global by definition. We've become very insular in New Zealand, especially in the last little while with COVID and one thing or another going on. And sometimes you really do wonder whether people are as aware of how global our agribusiness is by definition. We export over 90% of pretty much everything we produce. We are totally reliant on getting it right in those overseas markets and ensuring that we understand them, the competition, the various flows of various, whether it be ingredients or final products, and the part that we play in all of that. So I want to dwell a bit on that, talk about some of the trends, population and related trends, world food flows, where do we fit, what do we do, what are the challenges, and how does that sort of help us recognize the role that we play. In the process, I want to do a bit of myth busting. I hear some very strange comments. I think I've spent too much time in Wellington in the last year or so, but one that I've heard more than once now is that, oh, we only feed the rich, so it really doesn't matter if we stop producing food, which belies such a fundamental level of ignorance of what the role that we do play. We feed 40 million people in the world. We're part of a food map. And I try to describe the food map as something a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. If you take out that one section that's 40 million, those rich will still get fed. They'll take it from somewhere else. And where they've taken it from will mean those people don't get fed. So it is an interconnected map that we're all part of. And we need to understand the role that we play and why it matters. So then the last one I want to really talk about, and it's fundamental to this feeding the world, is the Sustainable Development Goals and how they are absolutely providing clear focus for so many agribusiness firms around the world, and how that's led on into then ESG and its impact in agribusiness. So here we go. I've got 30 minutes. I'm going to have to really rattle along. So let's first look at the world population growth, and I've purposely taken all of these slides to be pretty much from pre-industrial time, and those who are involved in greenhouse gas conversations will know that that's a sort of a critical moment in time by which we're comparing everything that we do. So yes, we do have population growth. Interestingly, with this, the annual growth is actually decreasing already, but we still are looking to hit a very high population by 2050, which is also the deadline for a whole raft of other stuff. There's a Malthusian expression that I find quite interesting, and you know, the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. I looked that up, and what he was saying is that the better we do, the more we populate. And so, but I think, in fact, if you look at the red graph on this, that is starting to do the opposite. The wealthier that we get, the less we populate, which can only be good in the longer term. What does that mean in terms of agriculture? Well, agriculture area over that same period gone from about 1 billion hectares to well over 4 billion. Interestingly, the agricultural land use per person, though, has significantly dropped. And that recognition of the efficiency with which we've been producing food over that time period comes through in more than one way. Out of that agricultural use, 3 billion of those hectares are grazing land, and then the cropland at the 1.4 to 1.5. So the distinction between those two is really quite important to recognise in terms of what our options are. There's a lot of land that can be used for grazing, far less land that can be used for cropping. So optionality in terms of how that land is used can be constrained in terms of that type of land. Interesting with grazing land, and this is some information that came out from a number of different sources as I was scrolling through websites for today's talk. Grassland's the largest ecosystem, 40.5% of terrestrial area, major reserves of biodiversity, important source obviously of livestock feed, and one of the largest carbon sinks at the world level. The usefulness of grasslands in terms of all of these things is often forgotten or overlooked, but probably the most important is that grassland as an agricultural source for us as humans is almost useless. We can't eat it. So we are very reliant on animals to turn what we can't eat into what we can. And so not only are they an important source of livestock feed, they are, in fact, the way in which those livestock are the way in which we, through those biodigesters, and those animals can actually have products that we can then consume. And if you look at that world population, that was a really critical part of that. This is some work out of Penn State, just recently come out, where they're talking about this large area that's used for grazing. But they also recognise that about a third of the croppable land, remember that's a much smaller area, is also devoted into producing animal feed. And that livestock production contributes about 50% of ag receipts. So they also talked quite a bit around the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, and how the developed world, the significantly lower emission intensity has been enabled through genetics, nutrition, health and management. But then a large number of areas in more the developing world have much lower intensities due to that low productivity and large numbers of animals. So we've got two quite different aspects to this livestock contribution. So we have this food, fuel, fibre battle. How should this land be used? Should arable land be used only for food? Third of it going to feed. Is that what should be happening? Should it be being used for fuel? Recently did a case study with some students around the Brazilian sugar ethanol business. Very fascinating industry where the land is being converted, was being used for food and now being used for fuel. Only 12% more arable land is available, apparently. Yet we have to produce more food in the next 50 years than in the past 500. There's the demand for food could double by 2050. Not only for the increasing world population, but also as the lower income consumers are being lifted out of poverty. Food, especially quality food, is the first thing they spend their money on. We need to double that productivity on those fertile non-erodible soils, which are already in crop production. And if you look at the next graph, we've done that pretty well. In that time period, if you look at the population going up, the cereal production and yield has actually gone up greater than the lift in population. So can we carry on? Can we double that production as population doubles by 2050? The battle is greater than food, fuel, fibre, and feed. It actually now, and this is I think quite a useful quote, the battle is for land, water, and pollution rights. And I think pollution rights could be called offsets in the same way. So can we use that land, in fact, to offset something that we've done elsewhere, whether it be a greenhouse gas, whether it be getting rid of product or getting rid of substances that are no longer required. So those pollution rights that people are prepared to pay for, and that offsets the use of that resource for food, feed, and any of the other things that are there. I know pharmacy doesn't start with an F, but it sounds like it does, so that's why that's there as well, pharmaceuticals. So there's a lot of different uses for this land, huge competition in terms of how this could be used. I haven't even begun to talk about the impact of legislation on how this land is used. Now, if you have settings that actually enable pollution rights to have a greater value than food or feed or flowers or anything else that's on this list, then that's how the land will be used. And our current ETS settings are a good example of that. We look also back to that same world population graph. And yes, the world has been hungry for fossil fuels, and the carbon dioxide has also lifted as the world population has lifted. And we know that this is now leading us into significant global warming. At the same time as the world population shifted, so also has the methane levels increased. And those methane levels, partly to do with the agricultural area increasing, but also, as can be seen from the following graph, from the fossil fuel industry. If this particular report, and I'd recommend anybody who wants to better understand the methane cycle to read this, it's quite complex, but it shows here that in terms of the emissions and the sinks, there's a change of over 100 in atmospheric abundance. So that was from the period 2008 to 2017, where the methane levels have been increasing by that greater than 100. Interestingly to me, when I look at the sources and the sinks, is that the sources in terms of agriculture, waste, biomass, wetlands, natural emissions, and the sinks are almost in balance, which sort of makes sense, especially if you're looking at grazing animals, because they consume the plant matter, they emit the methane, which then turns back into carbon dioxide, which the plants then absorb, and so on and so forth. So it's a virtual cycle. But over on the left-hand side, we've got the fossil fuel industry releasing methane through often leaky pipes and coal faces and others. And that the amount they have emitted in that time is almost the equivalent to the amount that we are out of balance, or that we've become warmer. Economists picked this up a few weeks ago in a lead article saying methane is the big issue. Most of their article was about, in fact, all of their article was about the fossil fuel industry and how this is an easy win. You know, if they could just tighten up the pipes and sort out the leaking plumbing, we could reduce the amount of methane into the atmosphere. What amazed me, though, is that when they actually presented that and when it came up as an article to read on my phone, the picture was of a cow, not of a leaky pipe. So we do have a lot of preconceived ideas around this. So we go back to how that global land is used. I think this is also another area that we need to be really clear that we understand as New Zealand agribusiness people. So of the Earth's surface, 71% is habitable, 50% is ag. Of that 50, 77 is livestock, including the land, that third of the cropping land that's used for animal feed production. 23% is crops, and those crops provide 82% of the plant-based calories, 82% of the calories, 63% of the protein, the animals making up the difference. So plant-based proteins are not new. But as we do know from the likes of the work out of the Redette Institute and others, it's not just protein and calories that we require in our diet. So it's the other items are in the food, the calcium, the iron, and some work that Redette has done, some modelling work suggests that by 2050, the biggest limiting factor in our diets will be calcium. And that cannot be gained from the plant-based food naturally. So the need for calcium, the need for iron, which also comes through from the livestock side, are fundamental to providing a nutritious balance by 2050. The challenges are there to provide both. So if we're looking at food security, and this is another argument that I've heard from New Zealand-based people who don't really understand food insecurity. They've never lived it. Even in the World War, New Zealand didn't have the sort of insecurity of food that the likes of Japan, the Netherlands, the UK and others did. Strong memories of my parents' generation of doing without for weeks, if not months or years. So food security is a critical part. There's a global food security of which New Zealand plays a huge part. And I mentioned that before around the global map. There's national food security, not to be confused with self-sufficiency, quite different, because you can get national food security with the right type of trade policies. And I think countries like Britain and others around the world, those that are not self-sufficient, Japan, not self-sufficient in foods, China, you know, most rely heavily on getting the trade policies right. Local food security is more around infrastructure, social policies and the agriculture that exists. I had a chat to my sister who lives up in Yorkshire. Come Brexit, there's a distinct lack of the sort of foods they were used to getting out of Europe in their supermarkets. And I said, oh, you just live on what you can grow locally. And she said, I'd get pretty sick of eating turnips. So, you know, it is actually about what can you provide locally, and is that sufficient? In terms of what food insecurity can create wars, can create massive upheaval. And grains in particular drive the food security. I've called it hysteria, but it's more than that. It is actually fundamental to people's living. And there are very long memories in this whole food security area. And you've got to talk to people from, you know, Japan and the UK and others who've known insecurity to know how important this is. It's fundamentally driven the CAP policy in Europe for many years. So along with food security or insecurity go changes in consumption patterns. So we've got global middle class consumption lifting. You can see in the graph on the left-hand side, the big movement there in global middle class consumption is India and China. And up in the map to the right-hand side, substantial increases in protein consumption, up in the 48, 41, 47%, Africa 70%. Between that 2000 and 2010, and this is as incomes have been lifting. But then looking to the likes of the Africa's trade balance, importing a third of their food needs. So that on top of the food security, you've then got also this change in consumption. Now, traditionally, this is an old diagram, but it's a nice one out of Cargill, 2016, and it explains how there have been what are called natural exporters, people with more land than people, and we definitely fit in that category, and those that are natural importers. And so on the left-hand side, we've got the North and South Americas, the EU to a degree, and Australasia and Oceania in particular. And then the right-hand side, we've got more of the Asian countries and others, Middle East and Western Europe. If you look at what's happened in more recent years, the big increase, and if you look at something like soy, here's China and the amount of importing that China has done. And in terms of who's been exporting it, then huge growth here in Brazil. So we've got, since 1990, a fundamental shift and a huge increase in trade in some of these main products. Interestingly, when you look at meat, the poultry imports have been, they are more diverse in terms of where they go, and the same with beef imports. We'll look more in detail at that shortly. Look at the global trade flows, and I apologize in advance, but most of these maps, you'll see that New Zealand sort of sits out to the right and is largely ignored, but we will get there. But if we're talking about those soybeans, the corn and the wheat, the fundamental staples, those plants that provide so much of the calories and some of the plant protein as well, the movement from Brazil here up to China, the North America through into Europe, from Europe down into Africa, and so on and so forth. It's interesting just to see the volumes and the destination of global trade. This is one. Palm oil is always contentious, raises a whole lot of issues around environmental impact and whatever. Indonesia and Malaysia would be 87% of the palm oil production. Where does their product go? Well, interestingly, equal amount, 12% goes to the EU, 12% to China, palm oil consumption, and the larger amount into India. So, you know, no one's immune from the impacts of what happens as global trade grows. Interestingly, for the EU, until very recently, palm oil was one of their key sources of biodiesel. So they could say, yes, we are very green, we've got biodiesel, but they weren't quite so openly saying, but it comes from palm oil out of Indonesia and Malaysia. I understand that has just come to an end, which is why relationships between Indonesia and EU are currently slightly fractious. This is very blurry. I'm sorry about this, but the arrows show a lot are useful without being able to read some of the small print, just in terms of the volume, because the arrows pick up the volume both of the corn, the wheat, soy, and palm. The World Fruit Map is very similar. Now, there's a whole series of these Rabobank maps, and again, you're not going to see any of the detail in this. That wasn't the intention. The intention was to see the arrows. A large amount of product coming through into Europe, out of the Americas. And there's a couple of little lines coming out of New Zealand, which we know what that's all about, but it just gives you an idea again of the amount of trade that carries on in terms of agribusiness. Interestingly, the World Vegetable Map is quite a lot less. I think the blue going there from Mexico up into the States is avocado, but I'd have to check that. But certainly that far less in terms of vegetables. Vegetables obviously would, on this basis, would seem to be more locally grown and consumed. Well, then we look at, well, what about the transfer of all those, of that corn, soy, and other products into feed, and what does that mean in terms of then the animal products and where they get transferred? So if we look at the World Poultry Map, Brazil, which is very much a powerhouse of this being the source, remember, of soy going into China, also uses a fair amount of what they produce as feed, turns it into poultry, and that poultry then also gets shipped all around the world. I think they are the biggest exporters of poultry now. The US certainly also large exporters, turning feed into food and then on into export. Another efficient use of feed, turning it into food, is seafood. And here again, we've got similar sort of arrows. An awful lot of arrows end up in China. Remember, not very self-sufficient in food, hugely reliant on these sorts of trade flows, but also a fair amount going into some other countries as well. Interestingly, if you look into Europe, I always laugh when I hear people say, well, the Netherlands are, you know, such a small country, and yet they export so much more food than we do. And what people never finish the sentence, they also import a huge amount of feed. So the Rotterdam ports, and I've had the pleasure of visiting them, are massive, and they include, you know, large amounts of feed and food and flowers and all sorts of things that come in from all over the world. And that then gets converted through animals into food and then exported back out again. The Dutch at the moment are going through a lot of deliberation around what their future will look like. And I've heard commentary from some that, you know, Rotterdam could shrink in size. They are going to curtail the use of all peatland. So there will be that will actually have quite a difference in terms of how some of these flows actually happen as we move into a different era. Beef, finally, we've actually got some arrows coming out, some significantly large arrows coming out of New Zealand, off to the US and up into China. But again, you can see large quantities of beef coming out of North and South America and through from there. And finally, dairy. And here, as you can see, we dominate. We're about 30% of world trade, but just recognizing that only 7, maybe up to 9, depending on what numbers you're looking at, of percent of total production in the world actually crosses borders. So while this might look a large amount in volume, most dairy is actually consumed where it's produced. It is a very perishable product, but for those of us who do trade, New Zealand is quite a key in that area, as you all will be well aware. Some of the things that actually drive these movements, and the chicken one is probably a good example, hog is another, and that is what they call the price to feed ratio. So when you get a hog to grain price ratio that's above the break-even point, then you will get more produced and more exported, and vice versa. And here to the right-hand side is the graph that the IFCN, the International Farm Comparison Network, put together that is similarly based on milk price to feed price ratios and what that looks like. I'm just going to skip over a little bit. I realize the time is running on. In those 20 years, this is some IFCN statistics. Again, milk produced has been up 63%. We've got an increase of about 2.6% annually in milk growth, and that is projected to carry on right on into 2050 as not only world population increases, but also the demand for that animal protein increases. Most of the statistics coming out of that are countries saying, there are 2 reasons we buy this. One is to ensure that we don't have, our children are not stunted in their growth, and the other is to ensure they have cognitive development. Strong drivers in terms of that increased demand for that product, for those proteins. Very quickly, I've talked about this global milk demand increasing 2 to 3%. The fact it's a very thin market. And yes, there are years when it doesn't increase and other years when it does, but on average, we're looking at that 2 to 3%. This is the very latest from IFCN, pulled out at the July 2021 figures. And you can see through this period, the feed price to milk price ratio was not attractive. But as soon as it does become attractive, then you can be sure that milk will start to be produced, and down will come the price again. So supply and demand. I don't need to tell economists about that, except the only difference here is that for New Zealand, we are not driven by the feed price ratio. And so when other countries in the world, like the EU, for example, were decreasing then because feed price ratio wasn't working, you can see the same dip for the US and Canada, the same dip for Latin America. In Oceania, we had an increase that year, and that was because it rained. So we actually have quite a different response to the rest of the world. Sometimes that works in our favor, some it doesn't, but it certainly adds to the complexity of dairy trade. And then I want to move on to Sustainable Development Goals. And this is the reason I raised this. It's some time ago that these really became apparent, and in corporate agribusiness, or being talked about at the IFAMA conference. They were very absent in conversations in New Zealand for some time. I like to think now that we are getting our head around them more, and we recognize that they're a key driver. They're a key driver not only to agribusiness, but to consumers, because this is about not only feeding the world, it's about ensuring that we are doing the right thing in the world in terms of our environment and our people, as well as providing them with health and well-being and the right nutrients. I've put this letter up, this comment up from Larry Fink. This was 2018 when BlackRock came out and said, companies had to make a positive contribution to society. They had to be business relevant, et cetera, with sustainability. And I stood there thinking, well, where on earth have they been all these years? Interestingly, though, they are there now and they're pushing hard. The banks are saying the same. Everybody's now starting to latch onto the fact that this matters and that they are going to back it, and either in terms of equity funds or debt funding. Corporate social responsibility is now called ESG, or is now picked up by an ESG metric, which is environment, social and governance. I love the fact it's gone to ESG, because yes, environment matters, yes, society matters, but none of this will happen unless governance is in the right place and doing the right thing. So that's all about leadership in government, but most importantly, leadership in corporate governance, the people who make the decisions around investments. Harvard Business Review has done some work. They've looked at a whole lot of ESG data sets, and they've said that yes, those companies that create real strategic advantage do so by adopting sustainability measures. Their metrics, their competitors cannot easily match. It's all about competitive advantage, but in the right way in terms of making sure it's also good for the environment. I won't dwell on this one, but this just gives you an idea of the way packaged food is what the claims that are out there now around food. Number one is environmentally packaging, so that gets to the whole waste issue. Organics definitely taking off again. There's vegetarian, there's a whole raft of different things in there that are influencing people. Lots of different ways in which third parties are providing quality assurance around these claims. Lots of research being done to actually further the evidence behind these claims. Interestingly, some work just recently on a whole lot of teenage girls in the US, based on their dietary fads and fancies, has shown that these girls will now, without doubt, have osteoporosis in their old age because of their poor nutrient intake through their teenage years. The science is there. It's been proven. That's why in other countries people are consuming stuff that will ensure they don't get osteoporosis in their age. Now, this is a difficult slide to show in a online presentation, because normally I would show this to the audience and say, okay, tell me about this company. Aren't they amazing? They're into sustainable nutrition, they're into sustainable rethinking plastic, they're into health and hygiene, gender norms, greenhouse gases, they're doing everything. Gosh, who are they? I wonder what they sell, because this is how they have picked up the SDGs and internalized them and made them part of the way they do business. So normally I'd ask the audience, I can't on an online environment, but here this is what they sell. And whether it's this company also be the biggest users of palm oil in the world, that's Unilever. I can't see palm olive, maybe that's not one of their brands, but the name in itself tells you what that's made of. So in conclusion, we are a key part of the global food map, delivering to sustainable development goals and food security in particular. The trends are for a greater demand of what we produce. There is no doubt about that. The world will need to be fed, and we are part of that equation. Society and the globe expects that we will achieve more from less. So yes, we will do it more efficiently. We will double our yields. We will ensure that we halve our externalities that are unfavorable, etc., etc. We know future markets and climate will be volatile, very volatile. And we need farming systems and in fact whole food systems that will reduce those emissions without reducing food, and that are resilient to climate change. So thank you.